Crack open any history book, and you'll read tales about the world's most honorable men and women. But being trustworthy and valiant is only one way to make a name for yourself. There are also those notorious liars who rose almost as high as their truth-telling counterparts. But of course each one had their bubble burst eventually. And that part of the story is gratifying, especially once you know what they did wrong. Most Americans will know the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. As a 6-year-old, the future president received a hatchet as a gift and he took the blade to his dad's cherry tree. When his father confronted him, the young Washington apparently admitted, "I cannot tell a lie, I did cut it with my hatchet." And, with that, his father's anger dissipated. His son's honesty was worth more than that tree, he said. Now, you can see why such a lesson would catch on. Honesty is the best policy, you know. Funnily enough, though, Washington never said he couldn't tell a lie. He didn't even take a hatchet to a cherry tree. Instead, one of his first biographers, Mason Locke Weems, invented the tale. He added it to the 5th edition of his book The Life of Washington, which came out in 1806, 6 years after the original. Marmaduke Wetherell starred in and directed British and South African silent films. But when that well dried up, he got a new gig. In 1933 the Daily Mail hired him to helm a monumental and arguably impossible job. It hired the one-time screen star to find the Loch Ness Monster. Shockingly, Wetherell did find some strange footprints on the shores of Loch Ness. But zoologists who investigated his claims determined that they were actually the footprints of a hippopotamus. Some say Wetherell became a bit desperate after struggling to find Nessie and ended up making the markings himself. The Englishman was a big game hunter on the side, and he just so happened to have a hippofoot ashtray as a trophy from one such jaunt. Experts apparently uncovered the fossil remains of a prehistoric, feathered creature, and it made the pages of National Geographic in 1999. It described the so-called Archaeoraptor liaoningensis as having the arms of a primitive bird and the tail of a dinosaur. For that reason, the discovery was huge. It linked dinosaurs to modern-day birds. Within a few months, though, the revolutionary news had been proven untrue. The creature had apparently been created by a Chinese farmer who'd found the fossil bits in 1997. History.com notes that he used an adhesive to put the pieces together and later sold it to a fossil dealer. The latter then shipped the faux relic to a U.S. museum for $80,000. Obviously, that ended up being a bad investment for the institution. In 1869 workers tapped into something shocking as they tilled the earth while digging on a farm in Cardiff, New York. They found the 10-foot tall petrified frame of a man. Some scientists thought it could be the body of someone who walked the earth in ancient times. Others wondered if it was a religious relic built by Jesuit priests. The crowds who rushed to see the Cardiff giant in person must have come up with their own theories for his backstory, too. No one could have guessed the truth behind the Cardiff giant, though. It turned out that a Binghamton-based businessman called George Hull had Chicago sculptors piece together the massive statue. Then, the entrepreneur ordered it to be buried on an acquaintance's farm. The reason for his strange project? According to History.com, he'd had an argument with a minister who believed that giants once roamed the earth. After Charles Darwin presented his theory of evolution in 1859 on the origin of species, other experts raced to pinpoint the ancestors of modern-day humans, the missing links in our evolvement. And an archaeologist named Charles Dawson found what he thought could be the answer to the puzzle: the skull and jaw of a man in Piltdown, England. At first, experts believed that the so-called Piltdown man was part of humans' evolutionary timeline. But as archaeologists unearthed more pieces of the puzzle, they realized that the once revolutionary discovery didn't seem to fit. Then, upon further inspection, it emerged that the skull and jaw had come from an orangutan which had been stained and manipulated to look old. Sidney Poitier had 4 daughters with Juanita Hardy and 2 more girls with his second spouse Joanna Shimkus. But a man named David Hamilton claimed to be the Academy Award-winning actor's long-lost son. He had no trouble telling the highest-ranking members of New York City's social scene about his strained family relationship, either. Eventually, though, the high-crust people on NYC's social scene figured out Hampton. It was the dean of Columbia Journalism School and Newsweek editor Osborne Elliott who realized that the man parading around town was not related to Poitier. And authorities made sure that Hampton repaid everyone for the free gifts and lodging he received for touting his fake father's famous name. In the 1920s and 30s, Dr. John Brinkley had men lining up to see him for a surgical fix to their impotence. Yet how did it work? Well, he'd create a small incision and then insert a goat's testicular gland inside of the patient. It made sense, at least, based on what the general population knew about the barnyard animals. They seemed to try and reproduce as often as possible, after all. But Dr. Brinkley faced plenty of opposition from the medical community, and it wasn't because they were jealous of a fellow physician's wild success. For one thing, the surgeon didn't actually have a medical degree. And inserting a goat's testicular gland into a man's skin did nothing to reverse his impotence. So, if any of the patients enjoyed any success, it had nothing to do with the treatment they received from Dr. Brinkley. It all started in 1848 when Katie and Maggie Fox were young girls growing up in Hydesville, New York. According to legend, they woke up to terrifying rapping noises on the walls of their home, and their parents couldn't pinpoint the source. It continued until the girls decided to respond to the noises and, it seemed, the supposed spirit behind them could understand and reply with its once terrifying knocks. This kick-started the kids' career in communicating with the dead. According to Atlas Obscura, within a few years they had 8 million followers who believed in their one-of-a-kind skill. But things went sour when elder sister Leah became the girls' manager. She seemingly schemed cash from their earnings, leaving both Maggie and Kate tired of reading people while still strapped for cash. So, in 1888 Maggie took the stage at a scheduled performance and admitted that the whole thing had been faked all the way back to their childhood days in New York. How would you look after running the Boston Marathon? Chances are, you probably wouldn't resemble 1980's winner of the race, Rosie Ruiz. The then 26-year-old crossed the finish line in the near-record time of just over 2.5 hours. But officials noticed that the young runner had barely broken a sweat by the time she crossed the finish line. Suspicious, perhaps, but they let her stand atop the podium anyway. Soon enough, though, the truth came out. Onlookers came forward to claim that they saw Ruiz sneak onto the marathon course in the race's final mile. The fellow runners didn't remember seeing her for the first 25 miles, either. And then, another shocking revelation emerged. Ruiz had snuck onto the subway while running the New York Marathon, which gave her a low enough race time to qualify for the Boston Marathon. You'd think things were looking pretty good for a British band called the Zombies in 1968. They'd just had a massive hit in the United States called Time of the Season. And the group were set to go on an American tour planned by a company called Delta Promotions. That all sounds well and fine, but there was a catch. The Zombies had actually broken up long before the song hit the US charts, and the members had no clue they were a success in America. So, Delta sent a fake version of the band touring across the country. It gets worse, though. They actually had two versions of the Zombies, none of whom were real, trekking the country and performing. Eventually, people caught on to the ruse when the band that performed had fewer members than the Zombies they knew. There are con men, and then there's Frank Abagnale. His career of deceit began at just 16 years old when he successfully posed as a Pan Am pilot as a way to get free flights. When it became clear he didn't know how to fly planes, Abagnale changed course and began working as a doctor in Georgia. Of course, he had no credentials to serve in this position, either. Abagnale went on to work as a lawyer in New Orleans. Although this job wasn't a complete sham, he had actually passed the state's bar exam. Still, his forgeries did get him into trouble with the law, and he spent years in French, Swedish, and American prisons. Eventually, though, he found a way out. Abagnale promised federal authorities that he'd help them pinpoint check forgers. While most kids her age were concerned with graduating from school, Elizabeth Bigley, also known as Cassie Chadwick, was already involved in crime. She didn't stop as an adult, either. The con artist moved to Cleveland, married 2 men and started a faux fortune-telling business. She served time for forgery after that, but Chadwick wasn't satisfied. In fact, her biggest con to date was still around the corner. Chadwick came out of jail with a new story. She was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate with a net worth of $75 billion in today's money. And that wasn't all. Chadwick claimed that he'd passed on the money so she'd keep quiet about her lineage. Her husband believed the tale, and lenders did, too. Soon enough, she was raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars based on her relationship to one of the world's richest men. Lung disease, cancer, heart problems, birth defects. We all know the dangers that come with smoking. And it turned out that tobacco company executives knew how dangerous their products were, too. Yet they repeatedly told the world that their cigarettes weren't so bad. The CEO of R.J. Reynolds testified in front of Congress in 1994 that the company's products didn't do anything to hook smokers or to keep them hooked. R.J.R. Nabisco CEO James W. Johnston added, "Cigarette smoking is no more addictive than coffee, tea, or Twinkies." Clearly, this wasn't true. And since then we've learned that tobacco firms had been artificially manipulating the nicotine levels in cigarettes to make them more addictive. President James K. Polk is often remembered as one of the biggest liars to ever sit in the Oval Office. And he earned that less than stellar reputation after igniting the Mexican-American War. Now, sometimes world leaders feel the need to start conflict for valiant reasons, but that wasn't the case with this commander-in-chief. It all started when Polk attempted to buy New Mexico and California from Mexico for $30 million. That deal would also include observance of the Rio Grande River as the border between the states and their southern neighbor. When Mexico turned down the offer, Polk sent troops to the river's mouth, a move that Mexico saw as an act of aggression. So, it sent in soldiers to protect the territory, and, with that, the U.S. president told Congress that Mexican forces had invaded the country. The zombies had actually broken up long before the song hit the U.S. charts, and the members had no clue they were a success in America. So, Delta sent a fake version of the band touring across the country. Here's more evidence than that, though. They say the original album cover for Yesterday and Today had the Beatles posing amid Ramit, a supposed clue that McCartney had suffered a terrible accident. And the iconic Abbey Road art features the singer-songwriter without shoes to depict that he was dead. After all, you'd need shoes while crossing a London street if you were alive, right? You probably know the story of Russia's one-time royal family helmed by Tsar Nicholas II. The emperor, his wife, and their 5 children were brutally murdered by Bolshevik revolutionaries in July 1918. Yet 2 years after the slayings, a woman emerged and said she was Anastasia, the youngest of the Romanov clan and heir to the throne. The woman named Anna Anderson told the world that 2 men had carried her body out of the basement where the rest of her family had been slain. They then brought her to Romania, where she could heal and live safely. Her tale had plenty of public support, but bona fide Romanov family members didn't believe the woman. As soon as the break-in came to light, the media delved into the story and found just how far the scandal had gone. We're talking hush money and wiretaps. President Nixon swore up and down that he had no knowledge of the plan against his opposition. He even took to TV to assure the nation with a now famous declaration, saying, "I am not a crook." Eventually, though, the White House cover-up crumbled, and people realized that the commander-in-chief did, indeed, know about the plan. And, before Congress could impeach him, he resigned from office with a reputation forever marred by the scandal.